So today we're going to talk about Sioux City in the 1960s. I see the 1960s as kind of the end of Sioux City, of the old Sioux City as it had kind of built up in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th centuries. And it's the period where the Sioux City we kind of know today began to develop, and with things like urban renewal and suburbanization, the development of shopping centers outside of downtown, and so we'll see all that. But let's go ahead. We're going to start off with a series of aerial photographs that kind of give you a sense of what Sioux City looked like at the beginning of the 1960s. Well, actually, we'll have some aerials that document the construction of Interstate 29. So one of the big things at the beginning of the 1960s that really began to change Sioux City into its modern form was the construction of Interstate 29. And here we're kind of looking northeast over downtown Sioux City from kind of over the Stockyards area. And you can see the right-of-way for I29 is being developed. One of the bridges that where Floyd Boulevard passes under has been constructed, and you might notice this is the old South Bottoms neighborhood. The I-29 project really kind of changed things, not only the riverfront but also some of the neighborhoods that were closer to the river, and the South Bottoms were one of them. About half of them had been torn out to make way for the highway. And for those of you who don't know, the South Bottoms neighborhood was a largely immigrant neighborhood with also African Americans. It was very multicultural, and a lot of people that worked in the stockyards and in the packing plants and for the railroads lived in that neighborhood. And we'll see the 1960s were the period where those communities in the Floyd Valley kind of were passed by the wayside because of various projects that were going on. Here we have another picture. We're down by the Sergeant Floyd Monument here, Floyd's Bluff. And so, first off, this is a nice color photo, but you're looking at the old Missouri River Railroad Bridge that was replaced in 1981 that you see there. And you can see kind of how the right-of-way for Interstate 29 was built, how they drove piling into the sides of into the Missouri River, and really Interstate 29 sits on reclaimed land. And so you really get that sense of how that was built. Here we have Interstate 29 out in the Riverside Park area. We're looking back to the southeast, and of course, so here you see Interstate 29. Of course, you have the old Gordon Twin Drive-In was there right between where Fairway and Earl May are today out in the area. And here we see the south edge of Riverside Park with a couple of the boat clubs that were still there along the Big Sioux River. You can see just a little bit of Woodbury Heights had kind of begun to develop, but that had been a landfill largely up through this period, so that area hadn't really developed. And what we'll see is what stands out to me is a lot of areas that have developed in the previous years. You'll see these big open spaces that would develop then over the last 50 years or so. Now here we have a picture kind of looking to the north over the west side. This is the combination bridge down here in the interchange for Interstate 29. And so here would be Prospect Hill in this area. Way off in the distance, I believe you can see Briar Cliff off this area. Way out here is where the Sunset Plaza Shopping Center had just been built. And so you kind of see what the west side looked like then. I believe West Middle School's right over in here. And here we have the kind of straight over downtown Sioux City. Now, this picture stands out to me for a number of reasons. First off, just the sheer number of cars you see parked along the streets. You know, we think parking downtown Sioux City being a pain today, but in the early 1960s, my father-in-law went to work for the planning department, the city planning department in 1960, and he said when he first started working there, about 12,000 people worked in downtown Sioux City for the various businesses. Some of the big department stores like Yonker Davidson's had 500 employees by themselves. And of course the railroads you can see the railroads still had massive facilities downtown, big warehouses, and you had all the big warehouses along 3rd Street that were connected to the railroads. And so this is just a normal day. There's not a special event going on at the auditorium. It's just people using the auditorium parking lot. There hadn't been a lot of parking ramps built. In fact, one of the old one of the old Shankberg warehouses right here at 3rd and Pierce Streets was being used as as a warehouse, an old grocery warehouse, or it was being used as a, not a warehouse, as a parking ramp. And there were only a couple of other small parking ramps, and so just getting finding a parking space downtown wasn't too easy. Because of course downtown had been built largely in the pre-automobile age, or very early in it, and so back when there were streetcars and such, and that was how people either walked to work or rode the streetcar, and didn't worry about things like parking. This is also great just because you could see the very far edges of the north side way out in this area, kind of between Leeds over in here. What today would be Indian Hills, and that area hadn't developed at that time, so that's just open farmland. And so to kind of put this into perspective, at the 1960 census, Sioux City had just shy of 90,000 people, so that's the highest population it ever had on a national census. It may have been somewhat more on either side of that, but that's the highest it got. But yet, everybody in 1960 was living in a smaller footprint than we do today, that we weren't using as much of the area that is used today, even though we have about 8,000 less people today. So here, another aerial view over, this is over the Floyd Valley. And so here you see what's left of the old South Bottoms neighborhood here. What were the East Bottoms on the north side of here's the Gordon Drive Viaduct. You might notice the viaduct is only 2 lanes. It was originally only a 2-lane viaduct from the late 30s when it was built until about 1965 when it was widened to 4 lanes. And so this is just before the Floyd River was going to be rechanneled. And the new channel was going to go from 18th Street up in this area and kind of right through the East Bottoms and the South Bottoms, what was left of those neighborhoods. And so between Interstate 29 and the Floyd River project, that kind of was the end of those 2 communities or neighborhoods. You may notice the big gasometer. That's from the old power plant at 1st and Virginia Streets. So that was one of the earlier energy generating stations in Sioux City. Here we have a view then over the stockyards area. So at the beginning of the 1960s, the Sioux City's meatpacking industry, as it had been established in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was still going quite strong. Sioux City had one of the largest stockyard livestock markets in the United States, usually 5th or 6th largest in the country, and also a large packing industry. One of the old packers, which was the Cudahy Packing Company, had closed in 1954, and so that's this open spot where there's still the smokestack left, and then Cloverleaf Cold Storage was beginning to develop its facility there. Armour and Company was still going, but would close in 1963, and you can see here's the open pins for the Stockyards Cattle Division. This is the Stockyards Livestock Exchange Building, and then this is the covered hog division for the Sioux City Stockyards. All right, now the other big public project was the Floyd River Flood Control Project, and it was largely the result of the 1953 Floyd River flood, which was the worst in Sioux City's history. It killed 14 people, did over $20 million of damage to Sioux City's Floyd Valley, and it was just a really terrible event, and it was by no means the first terrible Floyd River flood. It was one in a chain of them, but it was the most recent and in many ways the worst that had occurred. And you just kind of get the sense of the destruction that the Floyd River could wreak when it would flood. And one of the reason it was so deadly was that when there was heavy rain up in northwest Iowa in the headwaters of the Floyd Valley, the Floyd tended to develop a flash flooding instead of, like when the Missouri River floods, it's kind of a slow buildup and you have time to get out of the way. When the Floyd River would flood, a wall of water would come down the channel, and it would just inundate Sioux City's Floyd River Valley as the basin itself narrowed, and you can just get the sense of how it just destroyed the stockyards and packing facility and everything that was in the Floyd Valley. So just a terrible event. And so this led finally to a real outcry that something had to be done with the Floyd River, because the Floyd Valley at this time was really the heart of Sioux City's industrial infrastructure, with the meat packing, the stockyards, and all the railroad facilities and things like Sioux Soya Company, and there was just all kinds of businesses in the Floyd Valley. And so the Army Corps of Engineers agreed to take on the project and create a new channel inside Sioux City. And so they came in the early 1960s, they developed a plan that they called the Howard Street Alignment, in which they bypassed the old channel that had originally kind of come down to about 18th Street and then went on what today is 6th Street over to what we call Fairmont Street over by the Floyd Cemetery bluff. It kind of goes out of this picture. Instead, they proposed to build a new channel right through the old East Bottoms and South Bottoms neighborhood along what was considered Howard Street at that time. That's why they called it that. So that gives you an idea of what they were planning to do when this picture was taken. So as a result, the people that still lived in the old Bottoms neighborhoods had to be moved out, and this was a tough situation. There were a lot of people. They were oftentimes poorer people, and so the city had to figure out ways to find housing for them in other parts of town, and that was a difficult process. Many families had lived in that area for a long time, for generations even, and so that was very difficult. Now, as the result of some of the work that Sioux City had done in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Sioux City won Look Magazine's All-America City Award for the first time in 1962. And so this picture is the banner that Sioux City received. This is Marjorie Howe, who was the chairman of the All-America City Committee, and George Young, who was mayor at the time, out in front of City Hall getting the banner. And this was awarded for all kinds of, mostly for the flood control project, and then also for some other public improvements that Sioux City had been undergoing at that time. The last Floyd River flood that really did significant damage in Sioux City actually occurred while the Floyd River Flood Control Project was going on in March of 1962. This was a little different. This was a snowmelt flood, which wasn't a violent flash flood, but you can see the winter of 1961, 1962, I believe to this day, was the snowiest on record in Sioux City. And so when the snow melted, there was pretty significant flooding on the Floyd River, the Big Sioux River, and even somewhat the Missouri River. And so what you see here, we're up by Leeds, and so this is the gas, the petroleum pipeline farm that's up by Leeds. And you can see how the Floyd had really left its banks here. And this is the old Smith River Road and Highway 75 going through the middle of the picture. The National Guard was called out to stack sandbags along the Floyd River, and so this is down by the Springdale neighborhood, which is along Floyd Boulevard at 28th Street. And this is the old footbridge that used to go between Springdale, which was on the east side of the river, and what was Sioux Tools at the time on the west side of the river. So that's the area we're talking about here. So while this was going on, the Army Corps of Engineers was busy creating the new channel. And so basically what the Corps did was, from the northern city limits up by Leeds down to 18th Street, dikes were built on either side of the channel. And then from 18th Street south, a whole new channel was dug, as I said before, through the East Bottoms and South Bottoms neighborhood. And so that's what they were doing. Now keep in mind, when they were doing this is all area that had been, city for many decades, and so there were all kinds of utilities and things like that, and the city had lost track of where certain sewer lines and water lines and such were, and so as they were digging, you can see they dug the channel in holes between the streets, so they kind of slowly went through and figured out what was actually buried there, and kind of slowly made their way toward the Missouri River. And then once they had it cleared out that way and got the infrastructure built around it or diverted, then they were able to excavate the new channel fairly rapidly. And this really shows you how. So we're looking to the west over the Floyd Valley toward downtown, and you can see how the old channel, it came down here to what is 6th Street today, and just made its way back to the east along what the route that's South Fairmont Street where it hooks up to 6th Street today. So in those days, there was no Auto Row or any of those businesses along 6th Street. That was the Floyd River Channel. So really the guy that was, as far as getting federal legislation passed and getting the Army Corps of Engineers to actually do the Floyd project, the guy that was most responsible for that was Charles Hooven, who was the congressman from Northwest Iowa. He's right there at the center. And he's the one that had shepherded the legislation through Congress. And it took, as many big federal projects, it took over 10 years to get the legislation passed and actually get the work done. And so it was a long, drawn-out process. So here's where they're cutting the ribbon for Hooven Drive, which runs along the new channel. And there's also George Young, the mayor at the time, and other dignitaries. I believe this is Wally Wilson, who was another former Sioux City mayor. And so here we have the completed Floyd Channel in 1967 after it opened. And you do get a sense of, it's easy to forget today because it's been this way for so long, what a undertaking this was. All the railroad bridges that crossed that channel and of course, the street bridges. And so there was a lot to do to make that work. And by all accounts, it's been a very successful flood control project. There's not been a devastating Floyd River flood in Sioux City ever since. And so that, I think, is a testament to how successful it was. There were many other infrastructure improvements that had their start in the 1960s. One of them that is in the news again today is the sewage treatment plant. Sioux City didn't have a water treatment plant at all until the early 1960s. Like almost all cities, it just simply dumped everything into the Missouri River. And finally, in the late 50s, the federal government said you couldn't do that anymore. And so the process of building a wastewater treatment plant began. And keep in mind, this was a big burden on the city because, of course, Interstate 29 was being built at the time. The Floyd River Flood Control Project was going on, and then the wastewater treatment plant. And so there was a lot of financial hoops to jump through to make these things happen. And so here's just another picture of one of the pumping stations being built at the treatment plant. So that's one reason why today that plant needs to be rebuilt, is it's been operating for almost 60 years. So it's something that's been used for a long time. Another infrastructure improvement that was only recently completed was the 4-laning of Highway 20 in Iowa. This is a picture of the ribbon cutting of the building of the 4 lanes from Sioux City out past Moleville. And so many of the local dignitaries there are at the ribbon cutting, and this is in 1964, and the idea was that Interstate or Highway 20 would be 4-lane across Iowa fairly, within some years after that, and of course didn't quite happen until the last few years, but it now has, and so that dream has been realized. And here we have a picture of the new 4 lanes as you come into Sioux City. You kind of get a sense of how that edge of Morningside was developing at that time in the mid-'60s. So you can see what the original version of Sunrise Retirement Home is out there, and of course the water tower that was built in the 1950s. And this picture was taken from approximately where Menards is today, but it was where the Biltmore Hotel and restaurant were located at that time. Now, I didn't have a good picture of Sloan School. There were several new schools built in the 1960s, but this is in an aerial view, so it's kind of fuzzy. But this is a little Sloan School out on South Helen Street, way on the south edge of Morningside. So after World War II, most of that area from Glen Avenue south in Morningside was developed to accommodate the rising population and the young families and such that emerged at that time. And so Sloan School was one of those that opened in 1962. And then another new school was Herbert Hoover Junior High School out on Country Club Boulevard, where current Perry Creek Elementary School is today, opened in 1964. And so another expansion of this time of the junior high schools. And then Daniel Hayworth Junior High was built in Morningside in 1964. Again, to accommodate, you kind of get a sense here, Morningside was the part of Sioux City that was really growing at this time, to the point where Morningside, by the 1980s, had half the population of Sioux City, if not more. And so you had the old East Junior High on Morningside Avenue, and then you had to have Hayworth as well to accommodate the rising school population. Now, I do not have a picture of it, but this is also the 1960s were the time when the campaign to build the new high schools began, what was called Project S, which began at the end of the 1960s. And Project S was designed to replace Central High School with Old Sioux City Central High School with what today are North and West High School, and then build a new East High School. So that would all culminate in the early 1970s. And before we get on to this, the last thing I would say on that, along those lines, is at that time, Sioux City Central in particular was one of the largest schools in the state of Iowa. I believe the class of 1971-72 had something like 700 students. So I mean, very, very large classes. So very much in need. You know, that it was the baby boomer generation that was kind of reaching its peak in high school and needed that to accommodate it. Well, the other thing that really began to change rapidly in the 1960s was the meat industry, which had long been the foundation of Sioux City's economy, going back to the late 1800s. And so here we have a picture of the Stockyards District in 1959. You can see Interstate 29 is being built here. The bridges across the old Floyd Channel were being built, and you still at this time it was kind of. The Stockyards District was kind of the way it had been for many decades, but it really did rapidly change. One thing that began that change is right down here at the south end. This is a smaller packing business called Sioux City Dressed Beef, and it was started by Currier Holman and Lloyd Needham in the 1950s, and Sioux City Dressed Beef operated differently from the older packing plants like Armour and Cudahy and Swift. Began buying directly from farmers instead of buying only from the stockyards, and also kind of used an assembly line method instead of the old gravity plants that the old plants worked on. And this led to Iowa beef processors then in the early 60s, and that really kind of led to a decline in the meat industry in Sioux City itself. So here's a close-up of Sioux City Dressed Beef. It was never a very large operation, but it was very influential in how the packing industry worked. Its counterpart was Sioux City Dressed Pork, which later became John Morrell in the Stockyards area, and so this is that plant along the Missouri River. And again, operating along the same lines. And of course, then in 1961, you get the opening of the first Iowa beef processors plant in Denison, which involved Currier Holman and then Andy Anderson, who are the kind of the masterminds of that, and that really changed the packing industry forever. Was Iowa beef processors. At the same time, it was the end of the end of the old packers. Cudahy had closed in 1954, as I said before. Armour and Company closed in 1963, and in this picture, the old Armour plant is being torn down. And so all those old plants that had been operating in Sioux City since the late 1800s or the very early 1900s were passing by the wayside at this point. And so here we have a picture from 1964, and you can see now the Armour plant is gone, and the only one of the old plants that was left was Swift and Company up on the north end. Otherwise, but keep in mind, this is a slow process. The stockyards were still very big business through the 1960s and through really the 1970s as well. But the changes were underway that was going to eventually pass by the wayside. Here we just have one of the more modern plants, Floyd Valley Packing, that opened in 1965, kind of on the grounds of where Armour had been. And here's the big plant out in, the big IBP plant out in Dakota City, which opened in 1966. And so you kind of get the sense, so the packing industry was moving out of the bigger city like Sioux City into the smaller communities like Denison, Dakota City, Nebraska, eventually Storm Lake. And so that Worthington, Minnesota, you know, into the outlying regions, and that's kind of how it operates to this day. But you get a sense of how, in this picture, this is Pork Day down at the Sioux City Stockyards in the mid-'60s, in, you know, still very big business. Very would draw a lot of people to see, you know, an event like this. And here we have a picture of the old Exchange building in 1969 with the cars lined up. And of course, I'm sure some of you probably, if you do remember, especially on Mondays, on Sunday evening in preparation for Monday, the livestock trucks would line up at the stockyards from the Exchange building all the way past the Combination Bridge. There'd be these big lineups for unloading on Monday morning. And finally, here's a picture in the early 1970s. When the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was established in 1970, one of the first things it did in Sioux City was say the stockyards had to redo the way they were doing things here because it was polluting the Missouri River. And so what the stockyards company did was do away with the open cattle pens and built a big covered facility kind of on this space where Home Depot is today. And that's how the stockyards then operated mostly out of that covered facility from then on until it closed in 2002. All right, the other big thing that happened in the 1960s in Sioux City was the completion of the Pick Sloan project that built the dams on the Missouri River to the north of Sioux City and created the navigable channel from Sioux City to St. Louis. So once that project was complete in 1964, Sioux City was considered the northern hub of that channel to St. Louis. And so the idea was you could load barges at Sioux City and end up all the way to New Orleans. And so there was a lot of hope that was going to be a real stimulation to the agricultural economy in this area because the barges could compete with the railroads and such for transportation and trucking. Now, that didn't necessarily come to be, but that was definitely the idea. So what you see, I have listed all the various dams that were built on the Missouri River from Fort Peck up in Montana all the way down to Gavin's Point Dam in Yankton, and when they were constructed. But what that did then was control, of course, the flow of the Missouri River, but also created a narrower, deeper channel from Sioux City south. And so what you ended up with at first was a 6-foot channel at least all the way to St. Louis, and then eventually a 9-foot channel. So by narrowing up the channel, it forced the river to gouge a deeper navigation channel that could accommodate big barges like you see here and towboats. And so that was the idea, and that opened in April of 1964. And so there were several businesses then that kind of emerged along with that, and one of them was Big Sioux Terminal, which opened in 1964, so that was a grain elevator to load barges. The other thing was the Port Neal Industrial Complex south of Sioux City down by Salix and Sloan. And so the first thing that opened was a new power plant. What was Iowa Public Service at the time built its first generator, where the current North plant or the units 1 to 3 are. This is just the first unit that was built in 1964, and then was later added to. And then, of course, the beginnings of Terra Chemical, which opened in 1967, where current CF Industries is today, the big fertilizer manufacturing company. And out of the port of Sioux City came the Rivercade celebrations. And so here we have some pictures of the early Rivercades in the mid-1960s. Here we have a nice picture of Pierce Street looking to the south from about 6th Street. It's a great picture. This is a nice series of colored slides that we have. So here we're on Pierce Street again at about 4th Street, and so you can see the Kresge Five and Dime store, which was at the northeast corner of 4th and Pierce Streets. You can see Montgomery Ward's, what was the Montgomery Ward store at the time. Of course, the East High School marching band. In Rivercade at this time featured a lot of aquatic sports, things like speedboat races and trick water skiing and that kind of thing. And so here we're over on the South Sioux City side, looking back to the north towards Sioux City. And a great picture of the carnival. Looks like people are checking out the boats, and it looks like they're about ready to fall in the river to me, but. Now, the other thing that really expanded in Sioux City was the local National Guard presence in Sioux City. Now, the Sioux City had had the 174th Air National Guard Squadron since after World War II, since 1946. But in the early 1960s, in 1962, I believe, it was expanded to group level. So it became the 185th Fighter Group at the time. This picture is of some F-86 jets being fueled. This was a different unit that was down at the air base, which of course was also the Sioux City's airport. And this unit was fairly soon after this was sent to Oklahoma, but it gives you an idea of the planes that were flying at that time. Something that opened right at the beginning of the 1960s was the Joe Mackey U.S. Army Reserve Training Center up by Floyd. Here's the Floyd Monument, and here's the training center that's still there. Eventually there'd be a naval center there as well. And Joe Mackey was the first Sioux City resident officer that was killed in World War II that it was named after. One of the really big facilities that was here was called SAGE, which was Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, and it was basically a Soviet bomber detection system, an early computerized system that was down at the air base that opened in the late 50s and operated until the late 60s. And a lot of the housing, the Cape Art housing that's in Sergeant Bluff, the kind of one-story houses that are in that area were built for especially the SAGE, because there were a lot of people employed by this. And SAGE was, I don't fully understand how it worked, but basically this is before microchips and such, and so your computers were huge, hot machines, and so it was like a big cooler. And up until recently, this building was used by Turpac and other food processors over the years, because, I imagine because of some of the infrastructure that was in that building. Unfortunately for Sioux City anyway, like a lot of cutting-edge technology, it was obsolete by the end of the 60s because of different things that had gone on, and so SAGE passed by the wayside, but that was for a while something that was a really big presence in Sioux City. And of course, we have the fire department that's at the air base, which still operates to this day. During the 1960s, the Sioux City's units shifted to the F-100 fighter, which it flew in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And here, so the local, the 185th was activated in May of 1968 and continued then through 1969 in Vietnam and won many decorations for its service. And so this is a picture of the members of the 185th coming home after their service in Vietnam. And here we have, and they ended up, the 185th became known as the Bats because that was their call sign during their time in Vietnam. So one of the things that kind of stands out about the 1960s as far as how Sioux City developed was the downtown really began to decline. And of course, Sioux City, that wasn't unique in this way. Pretty much all American cities experienced this, where there was a decline of the downtowns and a building up of the outside areas, the suburbs of older cities. And this happened everywhere, including New York City and some of the United States' biggest cities. And Many reasons for this. One of them, though, was the automobile. The automobile had been around for a long time, but by the 1960s, the automobile was absolutely, essential in our culture. And one of the big problems with automobiles is you have to park them. And so there were different things that were tried. This is the old First Federal Bank, or First National Bank, that was at 5th and Pierce Streets. And this is a building that had been built in 1905, but in the 1960s, a parking ramp was added to it to accommodate cars. And then it was kind of an underground parking facility, and then they had drive-up service for cars. So these things became important to these older buildings. And eventually, instead of accommodating the older building, what they do is just tear down the old building and build a new one that provided the services that were needed. And we have several nice pictures of the downtown streets. This is at night. This is a picture of Pierce Street looking toward the intersection with 4th Street, and you see Kresge's there on the left, and the Martin Hotel on the right. And so this is the period where several of the downtown streets became one-way streets. So that was a beginning. Another thing, a way to deal with traffic in downtown. Here we have a picture. This is, again, Pierce Street, only here we're at about 5th Street looking toward 6th Street would be up here. The old City Hall you see. You can see Mickelson's is the men's clothing store there. Dwight Hoff's Sporting Goods is beyond that. And then there's the War Eagle building, which had the War Eagle bowling alley, and First Federal then had a bank on the corner. And you can barely see the Woodbury County Courthouse in the distance. One of the early parking ramps is still there. It's right to the north. So this is the Security National Bank building, and then the Willigus building. And this is that parking ramp that's on Pierce Street at 7th and Pierce at the southwest corner. That was in operation then. Another night view. This is of 4th Street, and I believe this is on Jones Street, isn't it? Yes. And we're looking to the east on Jones. So this is an area that in the urban renewal that would come in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of these buildings were torn down to make way for eventually things like the convention center today. And here we're on 4th Street, but we're at Pearl Street, looking back to the east. And a lot of this then would be torn down. You can see one of the Baumgart's old facilities here. But eventually, a lot of the buildings in this area would be torn down to make way for things like the Mid-American building that were later built. Here we have 4th Street. We're looking east on 4th Street. This is Pierce Street right here. So this is the Martin Hotel here. You can see on the other corner, what had been earlier Katz Drugstore was Key Drugstore at that time. I believe you can see Fantel's clothing store there in the distance, and so still a lot going on in downtown at this time. And so keep in mind, in the early 60s, this is still the retail center of Sioux City, but that would gradually change over the course of the decade. Here we have a picture. This is of Nebraska Street, so just right outside our building here, and we're looking to the north. So up here would be, this is the old Lytle block, which is where the MLK parking ramp is today. And of course, you can see the Warrior Hotel in the distance. So at that time, the Warrior was a Sheraton hotel. It had been since about 1956 or so. Looks like we had a Singer sewing machine business right across the street. And here we have, this is 6th Street from Nebraska, so we're looking to the west on Nebraska. So we're right by the Warrior. You have the Davidson building here and the Security Bank building there, and the City Hall beyond. And now here we're on, again, we're on 6th Street, but kind of looking on the toward Douglas Streets. And so the building you see right here is First Federal Bank. We're seeing part of where the library is today. In the distance where the library parking lot is, that was Sioux City Stationery's business. And you can see beyond it the Federal Building, which of course is still in operation today. And here, this is West 7th Street at Bluff Street. And in those days, this was West Side Hardware, and this little building's still at that location. And then next to it was Kidder Kneffler's truck part division. So that's where they sold their heavy trucks and such. Later, it was Fashion Floors. And here's 4th Street on East 4th Street. So we're looking to the east from the end of the 4th Street viaduct at this time. And now we're here. This is right before urban renewal really started. So we're up on 6th Street and looking to the kind of the southwest. And this whole block is where our building is right now. So this is our section, and this is the old T.S. Martin department store, which was right on the corner of our block, and then these are smaller buildings that were around it. And so within a few years after that was all torn down, and then eventually in the mid-'70s, this building was built for J.C. Penney department store. Again, so this is also our block, only taken from the west side of the street. And so in those days, actually no, this is on this side of our building. This is on the Jackson Street side. So this is the old Jackson Street Hotel and the Hollywood Theater that was to the south of it. And those were all torn down in the late 60s to make way for the parking ramp that's across the street from us. And so you kind of get a sense of what was going on here to accommodate the automobiles. A lot of older buildings were torn down. Now this is the old T.S. Martin department store here. So we're looking at the corner of 4th and Nebraska, kind of to the northeast. And on this would be the west side of our block, looking back to the southeast. And so here's the Martin department store, and then this was the Capitol Theater, another fancy theater downtown in the early 1900s. And so this is in the late 60s, and we're looking from about 6th Street, about 6th and Jones Street or so, and you can see the whole block where our building is today has been torn down, and the construction hadn't begun. It's a big open block, and then the block to the east was torn down, and eventually the parking ramp that's there would be built. You can see the Riviera Theater had been built already in the early 1970s, and under construction is what was originally Northwestern National Bank. Is today across the street is Mercy Hospital's kind of office building was being built. And then to go along with that, then, as downtown Sioux City was being transformed, a lot of development was occurring out on the edges of Sioux City, in Morningside, on the north side, and such. And so it was, to some extent, at the expense of downtown, that development. So one of the first developments outside of downtown Sioux City and the Floyd Valley was what was called the Tri-View Industrial Area. And Tri-View is along what became Interstate 29, but what is today Hamilton Boulevard. It was Isabella Street at that time. And this was the first kind of purposely planned suburban industrial development in Sioux City. Began in the late 1950s, and at first there were businesses like A.Y. McDonald out there. That was a plumbing business, and eventually in the late 60s, the Wind Charger Corporation, Zenith Wind Charger, moved its facility out there and had a huge facility which is what today is the Baumgart's warehouse, and so that area all developed really in the 1960s. The first big shopping center outside of downtown that was developed was the Sunset Plaza, which opened in 1960. And so this is an early view of part of the Sunset Plaza. So this is at West 28th Street and Hamilton Boulevard. You can see originally there was a Woolworths out there. Of course, Woolworths had been a staple downtown on 4th Street, right next door actually to that Kresge's that we saw earlier. And then to go along with it, so the original kind of anchor department store that was out there was called S&L, which stood for Salkin and Lincott. And later it was a Woolco and eventually Shopco. And then there was also a Red Owl grocery store out there originally where the Hy-Vee is today. And there were things like Blackstone Hardware, which was a long-time Sioux City hardware business, and many others. But so these were all things then were kind of competing with what had been the downtown retail space. So you can kind of get that sense. But, of course, there were new houses being built in that northern reaches of Sioux City along Hamilton Boulevard. Another big shopping center that was built in the early 60s was the Hillcrest Shopping Center, what we call the Hillcrest Shopping Center today. So along Highway 75 at Glen Avenue. And it originally housed a Bellis Hess superstore. And when that opened in 1963, that was one of the largest retail stores in the entire United States. In fact, I think briefly it was the single largest retail building in the United States, or at least like west of the Missouri River or Mississippi River or something like that. It was one of those kind of things. But of course, this picture just shows why suburban shopping centers are so popular. It's because all the parking. You got all the free parking, and of course, people live next door to these things too, and so it was convenient, and so it wasn't something that was foisted on us so much as it was kind of part of the demand. This is the picture. This is the little Sloan School I showed you earlier. That's what I got that photo from, this aerial view. This is just another view of the same thing, of the Hillcrest Shopping Center, only we're looking back toward the Missouri River. So that kind of shows that whole south part of Morningside that had developed since World War II, and the shopping center, and then the Floyd Monument and the Missouri River in the distance. Oh, so that's my last, it kind of snuck up on me. I guess since I managed to wrap it up without going over time here, does anybody have any questions or anything for me?